Hola amigos, this is Level 12, and today we are back with our 10th and final installment of WW1 Hetalia edition. I am so excited to be ending the series and that I was actually able to do it. It's been so much fun. Anyways, today's episode is called War Without End, and we will discuss the final events leading up to different armistice, the Treaty of Versailles, and the aftermath leading up to World War II. So, as discussed in the last episode, Germany was on its last leg while the Allies received a boost from the Americans. However, Germany wasn't the only place collapsing. At this time, the Ottomans were fighting for their lives. Serbia and the Allies both attacked Bulgaria, causing Bulgaria to sue for peace on September 28th, and Austria-Hungary can no longer maintain the Italian front. Austria seeks an armistice on November 3rd, while Hungary seeks one on November 13th. Germany held out for longer still, despite the command completely collapsing, and I mean that both literally and figuratively. Ludendorff collapsed on the floor and had a fit, he was so stressed. Anyways, the final offense Germany was a part of was the Meuse-Argonne offense, which was a complete American front, and it caused the Germans to surrender and flee. This battle also resulted in the highest death toll for the US in the war, capping out at 14,246. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, Germany surrendered and was forced to sign an armistice written by the new army commander, a guy named Foch. It was signed in this train car, which in 1940, when France surrendered to Germany, the Germans made the French sign their surrender documents in the same train car, because, humiliation. However, an armistice only stopped the fighting. It didn't necessarily end the war, nor did it resolve any of the problems that arose because of the war. The entire map of Europe was completely changed before Versailles changed it even more. New countries such as Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland had sprung up because of the collapse of the Russian Empire, and Serbia was actually able to make its beloved Yugoslavia. That was Serbia's big plan to begin with, and that is literally only the problems in Europe. This doesn't touch on Germany's territories in Africa, the Pacific Islands, nor China's last-ditch effort to try and regain the land it lost to Japan's invasion. So despite more than 30 countries attending the Versailles Conference, including delegates from Japan and the Ottoman Empire, there were 4 big players, all from the side of the Allies. Those big 4 are Wilson from the US, David Lloyd George from Britain, Clément from France, and Orlando from Italy. Now, all these men were liberals, but they all came into the Versailles Conference wanting something different, and mostly to suit their own country's interest, much like any other country attending these meetings. Wilson likely came in with more of a plan in mind than others, considering he had the 14 points. Wilson's 14 points were basically what he wanted to include in the Treaty of Versailles. These points include things like less armaments for all countries, not just Germany, self-determination of nations, which is known as Wilsonian democracy, and the biggest one, the creation of the League of Nations that would make things like trade and diplomacy easier. The other members of the Big Four did not particularly like Wilson's 14 points, especially because it went really easy on Germany despite giving France the territories it lost in 1871. In any event, the other 3 had their own agendas. Italy's main goal was to get as much territory for itself as possible. France, while also wanting territory it lost, wanted revenge on Germany, but we'll get more into that later. Britain wanted to look beyond Europe, fronting that it was for all those unprotected territories, but truly it was to safeguard British interests such as oil and India. So with all of this in mind, let's discuss what actually became of the Treaty of Versailles. The first big thing the conference dealt with was the issues of Alsace-Lorraine and the Rhinelands. While Wilson let France have Alsace-Lorraine, there was much debate about the Rhinelands and how much France got of it. This was really the first place self-determination was used, which meant that areas that felt they were French could be French, and areas that felt they were German could be German in a demilitarized zone. I can't say that this worked out very well, considering the Rhineland was split very weirdly between Germany and France, but Wilson still pushed for self-determination in other areas. See, Wilson wanted to safeguard minorities of specific languages and religions, specifically in Europe, so he put his foot down for no European land grabs. Just a repositioning of borders for already established peoples. Outside of Europe, he still maintained this, but he believed these new territories in Africa and the South Pacific needed guidance from a paternal figure, in which he called mandates, very reminiscent of the white man's burden thinking, if you know what that is. It's not good, by the way. The Europeans took this to mean imperialism by another name. Britain and France carved up the Middle East like they had always planned, while Australia and New Zealand took over the Pacific Islands that Germany once owned. Italy was the only country that never got the land claims it wanted, despite being on the winning side. The final area we need to discuss before moving on to Germany's short end of the stick is China and Japan. As mentioned earlier, China declared war on Germany in 1917 only so it could attempt to gain the land it had lost back. Japan did not want to give that land back. What Japan did want, however, was to make a little provision in the League of Nations that would make all races equal. Wilson shut this down and did nothing for the morale of the 2 to 3 Japanese delegates that went to Paris. Many of the Western delegates were blatantly racist to them and often commented that they smelled bad. Australia and New Zealand were also against this racial equality clause because of the Yellow Scare. They treated delegates from the former Ottoman Empire the same way, by the way. In a last-ditch effort, Japan asked for a quid pro quo, in which it got to keep all the land it had gained in the war, including Manchuria. China, obviously, was opposed to this. China begged to regain the land it had lost, yet Wilson, in an attempt to appease the Japanese, agreed to the quid pro quo. Now we get to Germany becoming a scapegoat. So, no one of the big four went into Versailles planning on making Germany a scapegoat. However, France was in massive debt to the British, and the British were in massive debt to America. Suffice to say, America was not willing to let Britain off the hook. Coupled with France's current anger, it was easy to see how making Germany pay, both literally and figuratively, and that idea looked more and more attractive. I think one other reason the Allies eventually went so harsh on Germany is because they needed this war to have a purpose to give reason to the abhorrent amount of life loss. Making Germany the bad guy and the loser would be easier to sell the final decision to civilians. The final kick to the teeth to Germany were the infamous reparations. These were meant to be paid to both Britain and France for causing the war, along with dismantling their entire army and giving up thousands of units of artillery. I'm talking guns, ammo, cannons, tanks, etc., whatever they had. The reparations totaled 33 billion USD, that's current dollars by the way. They were meant to be paid out until the 1980s, well over 70 years after the war's conclusion. Wilson, along with most Americans, were outraged over this, yet the other powers wouldn't back down. So, in shame, the 2 German delegates signed the Treaty of Versailles. In these provisions, knowing good and well it would be hard for Germany to pay back these reparations, which, by the way, Germany didn't officially pay off its debt until 2010, almost 100 years after the war's outbreak. Pure insanity. The issue over the reparations and Germany's treatment is actually what kept the US from joining the League of Nations, which, in hindsight, is probably a good thing considering the League did jack squat. So, how did people at home take the news? Well, everyone, and I mean everyone, was happy initially. The French and Belgians were happy that Germany finally left their countries and they rejoiced over that. France especially was happy to get Alsace-Lorraine back and finding out that the people were still, in their terms, French. The soldiers returning to Germany were met with a hero's welcome. Wreaths adorned helmets, guns, and cannons. Children waved German flags while sitting next to unloaded artillery. Soldiers either marched or rode on horseback to Berlin. Despite knowing, or at least thinking, they had lost, Germany was happy to finally be at peace. However, on both sides, these sentiments didn't last forever. Many men coming back from the war realized they didn't know how to do anything other than be at war. Not only that, a lot came back with both mental and physical scars. Men would lose feet, legs, hands, and arms to various trench diseases along with artillery fire. Some men even lost entire pieces of their face and had to wear prosthetics just to look normal. Not to mention the cases of shell shock, now diagnosed as PTSD. At the time, while people understood men were suffering from this, it wasn't treated as seriously as it would be today. As is common in people who suffer from PTSD, especially veterans, loud noises, certain sounds or words, or even dreams can trigger a PTSD flashback in which the sufferer is transported back to the battlefield. One soldier was so far gone, the only word he responded to was bomb, and he would hide upon hearing the word. And these are the men that made it back. Millions, literal millions of soldiers died in World War I, not including civilian casualties, by the way. Many women were left widowed by the war and later struggled to provide for their families because of it, and some families never even got the body of their loved one back. Verdun has a tomb of bones near it showing the magnitude of unclaimed bodies. There's one story of a British soldier who had died and was later buried in Belgium in a Belgian or French grave, yet later returned to Britain. This body received a hero's welcome despite no one really knowing who he was or who his family was. People came out in droves to attend this funeral because they knew one of them was coming home. His body went to Britain's Tomb of the Unknown Warrior, and America has one of these monuments as well. Physically, Europe was also scarred, much as the landscape was decimated by artillery bombardment along with not enough people to tend it. This, coupled with a weak non-wartime economy, would lead to many European countries sinking into a depression. With this depression, Germany struggled to pay back its reparations, which I think may have even been suspended for a short amount of time in the 20s. The final issue plaguing Europe at this time were ethnic tensions. Remember Wilson's idea for self-determination? Yeah, it didn't really work. A lot of minorities in places like Poland and the Baltic states did not get along well with the ethnic majority. A lot of these minorities were Jewish, and a lot of places started blaming their failures on the Jewish people. Beliefs like this, along with rallying for nationalism, gave people like Hitler their rise to power. All these factors are considered when discussing what led up to World War II, and there is even debate on how much World War I, particularly the Treaty of Versailles, influenced World War II. On one end of the spectrum, people think Versailles had very little to nothing to do with World War II, while on the other end, people believe that Versailles was the direct cause of the Second World War. I, along with other people as well, stand in the middle, more leaning towards Versailles being a direct cause. I think because of how humiliating the terms of the Versailles Treaty was to Germany, it was easy for a lot of people to feel like they needed to show that Germany was a world power. However, a weak government meant, along with a poor economy, even before the war was over, didn't help anything either. There's just a lot of factors. So, usually I would do my regular outro, but I wanted to read off some of the names of the dead from different countries. All the sources I used to find these names will be linked below. I could find names for almost every country except for Russia. I don't know why, but in any event, the first country we will start with is Belgium. So we have Florentine Jean Crabbe, Constantine Florentine Velman, Honoré Henri van den Daly, Leopold Desiré Charlotte, Auguste Goossens, Louis-François Gourmans, Ferdinand Ernest Simon, and Henri Goffin. Next we have France, François Ernest Alexandre, Louis-Marie Edmond Appel, Jean-Louis Joseph Bidois, Gabriel Capillon, Leon Coran, Marcel Lucien Dory, Albert Fur, and Augustine Kohns. Next is Germany. Ferdinand Wiedmann, Otto Ging, Johann Geil, Willy Kummer, Erman Wurst, Urs Frederick, Josef Schmitz, and Peter Concy. Next is Britain. Robert Kimball, James McCartney, William Frederick Miles, Joseph Such, Harold Gibson, Victor Charles Bartlett, Herbert Little, and Alfred Cox. Finally, we have America. Nathaniel Abbey, William Adams, Ernest Daniels, Glenn Dart, Henry O'Neill, Frank O'Hare, John Lipscomb Nance, and Herman Nash.